This is part of a growing series of CDs designed to help us all understand our emotional life and thinking processes more clearly. Ivan Tyrrell and Joe Griffin, originators of the Human Givens approach to psychotherapy, discuss anger and ways to manage it effectively.
Joe, we're constantly hearing reports of excessive expressions of anger. All the indices coming out seem to show that more and more people at all levels of society are getting angry, and incidences of violence are on the increase, in the home, in schools, the workplace, and of course on the streets. We hear road rage, trolley rage, and anger outbursts that complete strangers over the telephone.
I think, first of all, we need to see it in a slightly wider framework. It isn't just anger. We, as a society in the West, are becoming increasingly emotionally dysfunctional. When we look at depression, anxiety, as well as anger, people having problems in all these areas are massively on the increase, as all therapists know, of course. But statistically, we know this to be true as well. And we could actually say that roughly about a third of our society in the West is suffering from a degree of emotional dysfunctioning that would warrant a clinical intervention. Specifically, let's look at some statistics around anger. For example, when the economy improves, we know that crime goes down. And the statistics coming out from the central government show that this is exactly the case in England as well. However, with one exception, violent crime last year increased by 6%, and violent crime in the sexual area increased by 7%. And that's running counter to all the other types of crime which are falling. If we look within the health profession itself, for example, we find that doctors are increasingly reporting incidents of angry patients and incidents of being attacked, likewise for nurses. For example, with doctors, 1 in 6 doctors have reported that they've actually been attacked in their surgery. 2 out of 3 doctors reported they've been verbally abused in their surgery. 1 in 10 doctors has been attacked in a home visit. When we look into other areas in society, for example, every third day in the UK, a woman is murdered in a violent interaction in her home, usually by her spouse. If we look at road rage, for example, again, we can see that something like 2/3 of people report that they have been aggressively tailgated in the past year. Recent research coming out of the States has highlighted the fact that in the vast majority of road fatalities, road rage has been a significant element. And the government here in the UK has just recently commissioned research, which it is anticipated will bear out that fact as well as occurring in the UK, that road rage is significantly contributing to the massive number of fatalities on the road. So all around us, we're finding that society is becoming increasingly violent, it's becoming increasingly angry, and this is also, of course, is reflected in terms of disturbances in personal relationships, in our own intimate relationships. We are becoming more angry and less able to sustain them in the long term. So it is a major problem that needs to be addressed.
Because another way it's reflected is in the media, isn't it? That the more violent and explicit films and television plays and programs, and even in discussions, violent language is considered the norm now, which it certainly wasn't 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Well, indeed, and of course it's a controversial issue as to whether this increase of reported violence and focusing on violence in the media, whether that is a symptom of the general rise in violence and anger, or whether it may in fact be a causal factor. The jury is still out on that one. Although I would say that common sense would say that if young people are being exposed to tens of thousands of exposures of violent crime, that it must have to some extent a desensitizing effect upon people.
What do you think the actual reasons for this increase are?
Well, I think we have to look at the changes that have taken place in society since about the Second World War. And I think we'll find that there are perhaps a set of common reasons that underlie the rapid rise in depression, the rapid rise in anxiety states, and the rise in our threshold for triggering off anger. And clearly, there's 2 main changes that one could look at. One is changes in the structure of social relationships, the breakdown in the family, the less stable relationships in society because people are moving about, spending a number of years working in one area, then the family being dragged up and moved to another part of the UK to work in. So when people have a less stable network of relationships, they are more likely to suffer from emotional distress, They have less of a bulwark as well against unpleasant events when they happen. So the changes in terms of our relationships and the stability of them is one factor. The other factor, of course, is the massive changes in technology, which have altered our working habits. They have altered the way we connect to life. They have made us feel much more insecure. Nobody has a job for life now anymore, for example. Everybody's working in short-term contracts. The changes in technology insofar as they've actually changed our social habits. For example, spending 40 hours a week watching television, which the average family now does, means there's less time for conversations to take place between parents and kids. And the crucial thing that has to happen for a child is that up until maybe about the age of 2, we hear about the terrible twos and tantrums, but a child has to be taught to make the switch from expressing emotion simply through the emotional brain and through the instinctive responses of the, shall we say, the animal-like part of us, to being able to convert those emotional impulses into words and to negotiate their resolution. Now, that's a crucial distinction that has to be taught to children. It's a skill that needs to be taught. But if families are spending most of their time watching television, well, when is this skill being taught?
It clearly isn't with large numbers of children, because some of the most violent incidents in society occur in the playground. We've got cases now of children beating up and putting in hospital their teachers.
Well, indeed. It also follows, and research bears this out, that children who are angry, unless they're actually taught to deal in an appropriate way with their anger, grow up to be angry adults and bullying adults, and the problem continues with the person for the rest of their life unless appropriate interventions are made. But of course the wonderful thing is that the research also shows that when children who have been alienated in their school environments, when they have been very aggressive in bullying, when they have been taught in an active program of how to modulate their emotional responses and how to express them constructively, it has actually worked. You can go back into schools 2 years later after these alienated bullying children have been taught systematically how to express their anger in constructive ways, and you find that they are no different to the rest of the pupils who are able to behave appropriately. Not only that, but their self-esteem rises.
But of course this is marvellous news, but before we go on to that, can we just look at what the actual costs are to society of road rage, hospitalisations, health costs, lost work, etc.?
Well, in terms of society at large, of course, the costs are realistically incalculable, because in terms of productivity, of course, damaged relationships, the huge cost to a company if an employee leaves, the cost of replacing and retraining further personnel, and very often that's just due to bullying and through poor quality relationships brought about by uncontrolled anger. There is the massive cost of the health service of accidents, the massive costs to the insurance companies, for example, of fatalities and accidents on the road. But apart from those major costs, there's also the costs of the individual themselves. Firstly, the person who actually gets angry on a regular basis, the person who is, say, chronically angry, that has a major, major impact upon their state of health. It's a greater risk of dying younger from frequent anger than there is from smoking or high cholesterol or high blood pressure.
Gosh.
And in some studies where people have had heart attacks, those patients who are chronically angry are 6 times more likely to get a subsequent heart attack. So it has, has major consequences for our physical health as well.
I remember once being in Vigo to watch a football match with a group of chaps, and it was a very, very close game, and as the game progressed it got more and more emotional. It was touch and go whether we were going to win or lose. I think we actually lost to the Germans from memory. The excitement towards the end with us all leaping up and shouting at the screen was quite astonishing to me, and at the end the emotion was so great I felt quite physically sick and ill and depressed and flattened by it all. And I also noticed that whenever I have got extremely angry, I've felt the same thing afterwards. And I wonder if there's any connection.
Well, that's an interesting point, Ivan, because different people respond differently to getting angry. 2/3 of people do feel very uncomfortable after an angry outburst. And they can feel symptoms such as you described. And yet about 1/3 of people after an angry outburst can actually feel exhilarated. And to understand why these different reactions can take place, we need first of all to be aware of what anger actually does to our body. And as you know, we have this mechanism in us called the fight or flight reflex. And it goes back way, way back in our history. It is an emergency response to help us to deal with danger, either by defending ourselves or by running away from the danger. In ancient times past, our ancestors would have to defend their lives maybe from a hungry beast or a marauding beast or from enemies. And we needed to have that reflex to turn on that capability of becoming angry and defending ourselves very fast. And when that fight or flight response is switched on, there are massive physiological changes that take place at the same time as part of that reflex. For example, extra adrenaline is secreted, the heart starts to beat more rapidly, blood pressure rises, the sympathetic nervous system diverts the blood from the liver, the stomach and the intestines to the heart and the central nervous system and to the muscles, because the body is preparing for action. It's preparing to fight to defend itself. Switching off of the digestive processes, of course, has a major impact, if it's done frequently, upon the feelings that we're going to get from our stomach and from our intestines. And it's not surprising that many